Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, and I wonder, has your evening settled into a gentle rhythm, the quiet hum of thought beneath lamplight? Perhaps, like a certain physician in the company of Sherlock Holmes, you've noticed how the smallest details speak the loudest. Do consider subscribing so no reflection is missed. Now, let us begin. For it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. And should you wish to listen further, Watson's Margins awaits you on Spotify. The link rests just below in the description. Chapter 1. The Clerk's Confession. It was upon a damp and cheerless morning in late October that Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard presented himself at our quarters in Baker Street, on bearing with him what he confidently declared to be the simplest matter that had crossed his desk in a fortnight. I'd scarcely finished my breakfast when Mrs. Hudson announced his arrival, and I observed with some curiosity that my friend Sherlock Holmes, who had been engaged in a rather listless examination of the morning papers, betrayed no particular enthusiasm at the prospect of professional consultation. Lestrade entered with his customary briskness, though I noted a certain satisfaction in his manner that suggested he had come less for assistance than for the pleasure of presenting a fait accompli. He declined Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea with a wave of his hand, and settled himself into the basket chair with the air of a man who has recently enjoyed a small but gratifying triumph. Holmes regarded him with that peculiar stillness that I had come to recognise as a form of acute attention, though to the casual observer he might have appeared merely indifferent. "You have made an arrest, Lestrade," said Holmes without preamble. The inspector's eyebrows rose slightly. "I have indeed, Mr. Holmes, though I confess I cannot fathom how you deduce it. I have said nothing of the matter." "You have said a great deal," Holmes replied, settling back in his chair and placing his fingertips together in that characteristic gesture. "Your satisfaction is evident, yet you arrive at an hour when you know I am unlikely to be engaged upon other business. You seek not consultation, but confirmation. The mud upon your boots is of the particular clay found in the vicinity of the Royal Courts of Justice. Devin, the document case beneath your arm bears the seal of that institution. You have, I suspect, a confession in hand and a prisoner in custody, and you wish me to admire the neatness with which the matter has been concluded." Lestrade permitted himself a thin smile. "You're quite right, Mr. Holmes, as usual, though I confess I came partly in the hope that you might find some small detail I had overlooked. The case is indeed concluded, but it touches upon matters of some delicacy, involving as it does both the integrity of public records and the reputation of a nobleman lately restored to fortune." "Then pray be seated more comfortably, Lestrade, and furnish us with the particulars," said Holmes. "Watson, you may find this of interest. It is rare indeed that we are presented with a criminal matter already solved." I confess that I detected a note of scepticism in my friend's tone, though Lestrade appeared not to notice it. The inspector drew forth a sheaf of papers from his case and arranged them upon his knee with evident care. "The facts are these," he began. "Some 3 weeks ago, irregularities were discovered in certain archival records pertaining to the Darnley inheritance case, which you may recall was concluded last spring. The alterations were subtle but significant, having the effect of supporting the claim of Lord Blackwood, whose character has been the subject of considerable public doubt. The documents in question were stored in the restricted archive of the Court of Chancery, accessible only to authorised personnel." "And the nature of these alterations?" Holmes inquired. "Dates and signatures were modified," Lestrade replied. "Certain codicils were made to appear earlier than they truly were, thus affecting the chain of inheritance. Had the tampering gone undetected, Lord Blackwood would have secured an estate to which he had, in truth, no legitimate claim." Holmes nodded slowly. "Continue." "The investigation was entrusted to me 4 days ago. Within 48 hours, the evidence pointed unmistakably to one Edwin Mallory, a junior clerk employed in the archive department these past 14 months. The altered documents bore his handwriting. The ink was matched to supplies kept at his desk. He possessed a key to the archive room, and he alone was observed in that vicinity during the hours when the tampering must have occurred. A damning accumulation, I observed. Indeed, Dr. Watson, But there is more. When confronted with this evidence, Mallory offered no denial. On the contrary, he provided a written confession, which I have here. Lestrade produced a document and passed it to Holmes, who examined it with narrowed eyes. I watched as my friend read the confession, his expression betraying nothing. When he had finished, he handed it to me, and I perused it with growing conviction of the young clerk's guilt. The statement was detailed and coherent, admitting to the alterations and citing financial desperation as the motive. Mallory acknowledged that he'd been approached by an intermediary offering payment for his services, now, though he claimed not to know the ultimate beneficiary of his crime. "You have interviewed this Mallory personally?" Holmes asked. "I have. He's a slight, nervous young man, unmarried, living in modest lodgings in Clerkenwell. His manner was one of resignation rather than defiance. He appeared, if anything, relieved that his deception had been discovered." "Relieved," Holmes repeated, as though tasting the word. "An interesting choice of expression." "Guilt is a powerful burden, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "I have seen it before. The young man knows he has committed a serious offence, and he faces the consequences with what I would call a certain dignity." Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the grey London morning. For some moments he said nothing, and I sensed that curious tension that often preceded his most incisive observations. When he spoke, however, his words were anticlimactic. "It seems, Lestrade, that you have managed this affair with your customary efficiency. The evidence appears comprehensive, the confession freely given. What then brings you to Baker Street?" The inspector shifted in his chair. "It is perhaps an excess of caution, Mr. Holmes, but the case touches upon matters of public confidence. Lord Blackwood is a controversial figure, and there are those who would seize upon any irregularity in the proceedings against him. I wish to ensure that no detail had escaped notice, no avenue unexplored." "Very prudent," said Holmes, though I detected a note of irony in his voice. "Tell me, has Mallory retracted his confession?" "He has not." "Does he maintain his inability to identify his employer?" "He does." "And the sum he received for his services?" £50, he claims, paid in cash and already spent upon debts." Holmes turned from the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Then I can offer you little, Lestrade. You have your confession, your evidence, and your man. Justice, it would seem, requires only the formality of sentencing." I was surprised by the finality in Holmes's tone, for I had expected him to request an interview with the prisoner, or at least an examination of the documents themselves. Lestrade, however, appeared satisfied. "I am glad to have your concurrence, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector, gathering his papers. "The matter will proceed to trial within the fortnight. I confess it is gratifying, in these days of complexity and uncertainty, to encounter a case in which the facts speak plainly for themselves." After Lestrade had departed, I turned to Holmes with some curiosity. "You were rather brief with him," I observed. "Is the case truly as straightforward as it appears?" Holmes had resumed his chair and was staring thoughtfully at the ceiling. "What did you make of the confession, Watson? It seemed clear enough. The young man admits his guilt in plain terms." "Quite so. And does that not strike you as remarkable?" "In what way?" "Consider the pattern of criminal behaviour, my dear fellow. A man who has engaged in deliberate fraud, who has accepted payment for corrupting public records, or who has acted with sufficient cunning to avoid detection for weeks. Such a man does not ordinarily collapse into immediate and comprehensive confession when first confronted. He dissembles, he bargains, he seeks to minimize his culpability. Yet Mallory, according to Lestrade, displayed none of these tendencies. Perhaps his conscience overcame him, I suggested. "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Or perhaps, Watson, there is more to this unusually complete case than meets the eye. Lestrade has presented us with a puzzle in which every piece fits perfectly into place. In my experience, the criminal world is rarely so obliging." He rose and reached for his pipe. "I think, Watson, that we shall accept Lestrade's invitation after all, though not quite in the manner he intended. Tomorrow we shall pay a visit to the Court of Chancery. I should very much like to see these documents for myself, and perhaps to have a word with the confessed forger. There is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact, and this case presents us with a surfeit of them. I retired that evening with a familiar sense of anticipation. Once again, I suspected the game was afoot. Chapter 2. Evidence Beyond Doubt. The following morning dawned cold and clear, and I found Holmes already dressed when I emerged from my bedroom, his lean figure silhouetted against the window as he examined something through his pocket lens. Upon the table lay several newspapers, each folded to display articles concerning the Darnley inheritance and the scandal that had attended Lord Blackwood's claim. "Ah, Watson," he said, without turning from his scrutiny, "I trust you slept well. We have an appointment at the Court of Chancery at 11 o'clock, but Lestrade has kindly consented to meet us here at 9:30 to review the physical evidence. I thought it prudent to examine the materials before venturing into the archive itself. You notified Lestrade of your interest then?" "I sent a telegram last evening. He responded with admirable promptness, though I suspect his cooperation stems less from doubt than from a desire to demonstrate the thoroughness of his investigation." Holmes set down his lens and turned to face me. "No matter. We shall see what we shall see." Mrs. Hudson had scarcely cleared our breakfast things when the inspector arrived, accompanied by a uniformed constable bearing a locked evidence case. Lestrade greeted us with cheerful confidence, apparently untroubled by Holmes's decision to pursue the matter further. "I anticipated your request, Mr. Holmes," said he, directing the constable to place the case upon our dining table. "I have brought everything pertinent to the case. The altered documents themselves remain in the custody of the court, but I have photographic reproductions of sufficient clarity for examination. The other items are originals." Holmes rubbed his hands together with an eagerness I had not seen the previous day. "Excellent, Lestrade. Let us proceed systematically. First, the documents themselves." The inspector unlocked the case and withdrew a portfolio containing several large photographs. These he arranged upon the table, and Holmes and I bent to examine them. Even in reproduction, the alterations were visible to the trained eye. Certain dates had been modified, the original figures scraped away and new ones inserted. Signatures had been reinforced or subtly changed. The work was delicate but detectable. "You observe the hand, Watson?" Holmes inquired, gesturing to one of the modified entries. I studied the writing carefully. "It appears consistent throughout, a neat clerkly script." "Precisely. And here," Holmes indicated a sample of Mallory's ordinary correspondence, "we have the young man's authenticated handwriting. Lestrade, you have had these compared by an expert?" "I have indeed. Mr. Ashford of the British Museum examined them personally. He confirms that the alterations were made by the same hand that penned Mallory's letters and daily records." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes moving between the samples with that peculiar intensity that signified deep concentration. "The ink, Lestrade. You mentioned it was matched to Mallory's supplies." The inspector produced 2 small bottles, each labelled and sealed. "The first contains ink from Mallory's desk. The second is a sample extracted from the altered documents. Our chemist performed comparative analysis. The composition is identical, a standard iron gall formulation sold by stationers throughout London, but the specific mixture, including certain impurities, matches precisely." "May I examine them?" "Of course." Holmes uncorked each bottle in turn, studying the contents with his lens and then applying minute drops to blotting paper. He observed the spreading patterns, the colour, the rate of absorption. Finally, he set the samples aside with a thoughtful expression. "And the key, Lestrade? You mentioned Mallory possessed exclusive access." From the evidence case, the inspector withdrew a heavy brass key attached to a numbered tag. This was found in Mallory's desk drawer. It opens the archive room where the documents are stored. Only 3 such keys exist. The master is held by the chief archivist, Mr. Halberd. The second belongs to the senior clerk, who was on holiday in Scotland during the period when the alterations must have occurred. This third key was issued to Mallory in his capacity as junior clerk responsible for retrieval and filing. Holmes took the key and examined it closely, turning it over in his long fingers. No signs of recent cutting or duplication. None whatsoever. It is the original, or issued to Mallory upon his appointment 14 months ago, and the lock itself shows no evidence of tampering or forcing. The lock is sound, Mr. Holmes. I examined it myself. Holmes placed the key upon the table and leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together. Now then, Lestrade, you mentioned witnesses. Persons who observed Mallory in the vicinity of the archive at suspicious hours. Lestrade consulted his notebook. 3 individuals, Mr. Holmes. The night porter, Samuel Griggs, observed Mallory entering the building at 8:30 on the evening of October 3rd. He signed the register and stated he had forgotten certain papers required for the following day's work. A plausible explanation, surely. Indeed, but Griggs reports that Mallory appeared nervous and agitated, quite unlike his usual demeanour. Moreover, the papers Mallory claimed to have retrieved were never entered into the daily log, suggesting he obtained something else entirely. Or nothing at all, Holmes murmured. Continue. The second witness is Miss Pemberton, a typist employed in an adjacent office. She was working late on the evening of October 7th and heard footsteps in the corridor leading to the archive. Upon investigation, she observed a light beneath the archive door and heard the sound of papers being handled. She did not intrude, assuming it was legitimate business, but she noted the time as being just after 9 o'clock. Did she identify Mallory specifically? She did not see the individual in question, but Mallory was the only person authorised to be in that section of the building at such an hour. The night porter's log confirms that no other clerk entered the premises that evening. Holmes's expression remained neutral. And the third witness? Mr. Bartholomew Reed, a senior clerk who shares an office with Mallory. He testifies that during the week of October 10th, Mallory was unusually distracted and anxious. He made errors in his filings, missed several appointments, and on one occasion was discovered staring at his hands, with what Reed described as an expression of profound distress. The behaviour of a guilty conscience, I suggested. So it would appear, Dr. Watson, Lestrade agreed, and there is one final element that places the matter beyond reasonable doubt. He reached into the evidence case and withdrew a folded document which he handled with particular care. This was discovered yesterday, concealed beneath a loose floorboard in Mallory's lodgings. We obtained a warrant to search the premises after his confession, seeking any evidence of his mysterious employer. Holmes took the document and unfolded it with deliberate slowness. I moved closer to observe, and what I saw sent a chill through me. It was a draft, written in the same hand as the alterations, practicing the precise modifications that had been made to the official records. Dates, signatures, and amendments were rehearsed multiple times, showing the development of skill and confidence. "This is in Mallory's hand?" I asked, though the answer seemed evident. "Confirmed by the same expert who examined the other documents," said Lestrade. "It demonstrates premeditation, Mr. Holmes. Mallory did not act in a moment of weakness. He practiced his forgeries, perfected them, and then executed them with deliberate intent." Holmes studied the draft in silence, his brow furrowed. He turned it to catch the light from different angles, examined the paper quality, and finally set it down with a gesture that suggested neither satisfaction nor dismissal. "It is indeed compelling," he said quietly. "Tell me, Lestrade, when you confronted Mallory with this evidence, how did he respond?" "He showed no surprise whatsoever. He simply nodded and stated that he had forgotten it was there. His resignation was complete." "And yet he refuses to name his employer. He maintains that the intermediary who approached him wore a disguise and spoke in an affected accent. He received his instructions and his payment in a public house, and he never saw the man again. A convenient story, Mr. Holmes, but one that cannot be disproven." Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have built a formidable case, Lestrade. The handwriting evidence, the ink analysis, the exclusive access, the witness testimony, and now this draft. Each element supports and reinforces the others. A jury would convict upon half such evidence. The inspector permitted himself a satisfied smile. Then you agree that the matter is settled? Holmes paused in his pacing and regarded Lestrade with an unreadable expression. I agree that the case as presented is remarkably complete. So complete, in fact, that I find myself curious to hear what the accused himself has to say. You've arranged our visit to the court. I have. Mallory is being held in the courthouse cells pending his arraignment. That he has consented to speak with you, though I warn you, Mr. Holmes, you will find him quite resigned to his fate. Resignation, said Holmes, is a state of mind that bears examination. Very well, Lestrade. Watson and I shall meet you at the Court of Chancery at the appointed hour. I should like to see both the archive and the prisoner. After Lestrade had departed with his evidence, I turned to Holmes with some perplexity. Surely, Holmes, even you must acknowledge the weight of this evidence. The man has confessed, and every material fact supports his guilt. Holmes had returned to the window and stood gazing out at Baker Street. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than argumentative. Consider, Watson, the nature of certainty. We are presented with a narrative in which each piece of evidence fits perfectly into place, like a puzzle assembled by a careful hand. The handwriting matches, the ink matches, the access was exclusive, the behaviour was suspicious, and the hidden draft confirms premeditation. It is, as you say, overwhelming. Then what troubles you? He turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw that gleam of intellectual excitement that presaged his greatest triumphs. What troubles me, my dear Watson, is precisely that perfection. In my experience, human affairs are rarely so neat. Criminals make mistakes, evidence is ambiguous, witnesses contradict themselves. Yet here we have a case in which every element aligns with mathematical precision. It is, if I may say so, unusually complete. He reached for his coat. Come, Watson, let us visit Mr. Edwin Mallory and hear what this paragon of confession has to tell us. I suspect we may learn more from what he does not say than from what he does. Chapter 3. The Unquestioned Premise. The Court of Chancery presented a facade of stern Victorian propriety, its Portland stone exterior darkened by decades of London soot. We arrived shortly before the appointed hour, and Lestrade met us at the entrance with the air of a man confident in his ground. The interior proved to be a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each devoted to the endless machinery of legal administration. Our guide was Mr. Septimus Halberd, the chief archivist, a man of perhaps 50 years with iron grey hair and the stooped shoulders common to those who spend their lives bent over documents. He greeted us with formal courtesy, though I detected a certain wariness in his manner, as though he regarded our visit as an implicit criticism of his stewardship. Gentlemen, said he, after Lestrade had performed the necessary introductions, I am at your disposal, though I confess the matter seems quite straightforward. The irregularities were discovered during a routine audit, and young Mallory's guilt has been established beyond question. Nevertheless, said Holmes mildly, I should be grateful for an opportunity to examine the scene of the offence. Professional curiosity, you understand. Halberd inclined his head and led us through a series of increasingly narrow passages until we reached a heavy oak door bearing a brass plate inscribed with the words, Restricted Archive. He produced a key identical to the one we had examined earlier and unlocked the door, which swung open with a protesting creak. The archive room was smaller than I had anticipated, perhaps 20 feet square, with shelves extending from floor to ceiling on 3 walls. The fourth wall was occupied by a large window, fitted with iron bars and overlooking an inner courtyard. A single desk stood in the centre of the room, its surface bare save for a ledger and an inkwell. The air held that peculiar scent of old paper and leather bindings that pervades all such repositories. Holmes stood upon the threshold for several moments, his keen eyes sweeping the chamber with methodical precision. Then he advanced into the room and began a systematic examination that left nothing unobserved. He inspected the shelves, noting the cataloguing system and the arrangement of documents. He examined the desk, the chair, the window, and even the floorboards. Lestrade and Halberd watched with varying degrees of patience as my friend conducted his investigation. "The documents in question," Holmes said at length. "Where precisely were they stored?" Halberd moved to a shelf on the eastern wall and indicated a section marked with a paper label. "Here, Mr. Holmes, the Darnley inheritance files spanning 3 generations. They occupy approximately 2 linear feet of shelf space, and the cataloguing system ensures that any removal or consultation is recorded. Indeed, each file bears a reference number, and any person wishing to consult a document must enter the request in this ledger." Halberd indicated the volume upon the desk. The date, time, document reference, and purpose of consultation are all noted, along with the signature of the clerk. Holmes opened the ledger and turned its pages with delicate fingers. "I observe that Mallory signed out various Darnley files on multiple occasions during September and early October." "Quite so. His duties included responding to inquiries from solicitors and preparing summaries for judicial review. His access to these particular documents was entirely legitimate." "Which made the subsequent forgery all the more convenient," Lestrade observed. Holmes did not respond to this remark, but continued his examination of the ledger. "Mr. Halberd, when were the alterations discovered?" "On October 15th, during our quarterly audit. I personally noted inconsistencies in the documentation and immediately notified the authorities." "You have conducted such audits regularly throughout your tenure?" "Without fail, Mr. Holmes. Every 3 months, I review a selection of high-profile cases to ensure the integrity of the records." "And prior to October 15th, you had examined these particular documents when?" Halberd consulted a separate register. "The previous audit of the Darnley files was conducted in mid-July. At that time, I noted no irregularities whatsoever." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "So the alterations must have been made between mid-July and mid-October, a window of 3 months." "Precisely," said Lestrade. "And during that period, Mallory had exclusive responsibility for these files. The correlation is unmistakable." "Exclusive responsibility," Holmes repeated, as though testing the phrase. He moved to the window and examined the courtyard below. "This window, I perceive, provides the only natural light for the room." "That is correct," said Halberd. "The gas lamps are used only during winter months or when work extends past sunset." "And the room is kept locked at all times when not in use?" "Invariably. The keys are held only by myself and my 2 senior clerks, as Inspector Lestrade has already informed you." Holmes turned from the window and regarded the chief archivist with penetrating attention. "Tell me, Mr. Halberd, in your professional opinion, would it be possible for someone to alter these documents without leaving some trace of their activity in your ledger?" Halberd considered the question carefully. "Well, in theory, yeah, I suppose one might sign out a file for legitimate purposes and then make unauthorized modifications while ostensibly conducting authorized research. However, such deception would require considerable nerve and the certainty of not being interrupted. But it would be possible. Yes, Mr. Holmes. Regrettably, it would be possible." Holmes began to pace the narrow confines of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. I had witnessed this behaviour countless times and knew it signified intense cogitation. Lestrade shifted impatiently, clearly eager to proceed to the interview with Mallory, but Holmes appeared oblivious to all external considerations. "The assumption," Holmes said at last, "which underlies this entire investigation is that the alterations were made recently, specifically between July and October of this year, because that is when they were discovered. But is this assumption necessarily correct?" Lestrade frowned. "I don't follow you, Mr. Holmes." "Consider the logic, Inspector. We know that the alterations were not present in July, because Mr. Halberd's audit found the documents in order. We know that they were present in October, because that audit revealed the forgeries. Therefore, we conclude that the alterations were made during the intervening 3 months. Yes? Precisely so." But what if the alterations were made before July, and Mr. Halbert's audit simply failed to detect them? A flush crept into the chief archivist's face. I assure you, Mr. Holmes, my audits are conducted with the utmost thoroughness. I would not have overlooked such modifications. Holmes raised a placating hand. I intend no criticism of your professional competence, Mr. Halbert, but even the most careful examination can overlook subtle alterations, particularly if one is not specifically searching for them. The human eye sees what it expects to see. But what purpose would such speculation serve? Lestrade demanded. Mallory was not employed here before July. He commenced his duties in August of last year. If the alterations were made prior to July, he could not possibly be responsible. Exactly so, said Holmes quietly. There was a moment of silence as the implications of this statement settled upon us. Lestrade's expression darkened, while Halbert appeared both affronted and alarmed. Are you suggesting, the inspector said with barely controlled irritation, that we have arrested an innocent man? That this entire investigation has been built upon a false premise? I am suggesting nothing of the kind, Lestrade. I am merely observing that the timing of the forgeries is an assumption rather than an established fact. It is an assumption that appears reasonable, even inevitable, but it remains unverified. Then how would you propose to verify it? Holmes turned to Halbert. The documents themselves, Mr. Halbert. Might it be possible to examine the original files rather than photographic reproductions? There are certain tests that can determine the age of ink and paper with reasonable accuracy. The chief archivist hesitated. The files are evidence in a criminal proceeding, Mr. Holmes. I would require authorization from the court to release them for examination. But such authorization could be obtained. I believe so. Yes. Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction. Then I suggest, Lestrade, that you make the necessary arrangements. In the meanwhile, I should like to speak with Mr. Mallory. His perspective on these matters may prove illuminating. As we departed the archive room, I drew alongside my friend and spoke in a lowered voice. Holmes, do you truly believe the forgeries might have been made before Mallory's employment? I believe, Watson, that every investigation begins with assumptions, and that the wisest course is to examine those assumptions before building elaborate structures upon them. In this case, everyone has assumed that the documents were altered recently, simply because they were discovered recently. It is a natural assumption, perhaps even a probable one. But it is not necessarily true. And if it proves false, Holmes's expression was grave, then everything else follows wrongly, and we must begin again from first principles. That is the danger of certainty, my dear fellow. It blinds us to alternative possibilities. We descended a narrow staircase toward the courthouse cells, where Edwin Mallory awaited our inquiry. I found myself both intrigued and unsettled by Holmes's line of reasoning. If the young clerk was indeed innocent, then some other hand had committed the forgery, and contrived to place the blame upon him with diabolical precision. It was a thought that sent a chill down my spine, for it suggested a criminal intellect of uncommon cunning. Yet I reminded myself that we had seen the evidence, heard the confession, and observed the damning draught concealed in Mallory's own lodgings. Surely, I thought, Holmes's scepticism would prove unfounded, and the case would stand as Lestrade had presented it. I was soon to learn how profoundly mistaken that assumption would prove to be. Chapter 4. Ink and Assumption. The cells beneath the Court of Chancery were austere but not unkind, their whitewashed walls and barred windows speaking more of administrative necessity than of deliberate cruelty. We were conducted to a small interview room where Edwin Mallory sat awaiting us, his hands folded upon a plain wooden table. He rose as we entered, a gesture of politeness that seemed at odds with his circumstances. My first impression of the young clerk was of profound weariness. He was slight of build, perhaps 25 years of age, with fair hair and pale features that suggested either ill health or prolonged anxiety. His clothing, though neat, bore the marks of economical maintenance, and his collar showed the careful attention of one accustomed to making modest means stretch far. Lestrade performed the introductions with businesslike efficiency, and Mallory acknowledged us with a brief nod before resuming his seat. Holmes settled himself opposite the prisoner and regarded him with that peculiar stillness that characterized his most intense observations. "Mr. Mallory," Holmes began, his voice neither harsh nor sympathetic, "I understand you have confessed to altering certain documents pertaining to the Darnley inheritance." "I have, sir." The voice was quiet but steady, bearing the accent of Surrey or Sussex. "And you maintain this confession freely, without coercion or duress?" "I do." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together. "Then perhaps you will indulge my curiosity on several points of detail. The alterations themselves required considerable skill. Had you any previous experience with such work?" Mallory hesitated, and I observed a flicker of confusion cross his features. "I am a clerk, Mr. Holmes. My profession demands a careful hand and attention to precise copying. I would not say I possessed special skill, merely the competence expected of my position. Yet the modifications were executed with remarkable subtlety. The dates altered, the signatures reinforced. This suggests not merely competence, but practiced expertise. I do not know what to tell you, sir." "I did what I did." Holmes extracted from his pocket the photographs we had examined earlier and spread them upon the table. "These are reproductions of the altered documents. Would you be so good as to indicate precisely which modifications you made?" Mallory studied the photographs with apparent reluctance. After a lengthy pause, he pointed to several entries. "These dates here, and this signature, the amendments to the codicil." His finger moved across the images with hesitation rather than recognition. "You seem uncertain," Holmes observed. "It was some weeks ago, Mr. Holmes. The details have blurred in my memory." "Indeed." Holmes gathered the photographs and replaced them in his pocket. "Tell me about the ink you used. Inspector Lestrade informs me it was taken from your desk." "I suppose it must have been. I keep a supply for my daily work." "You suppose? You do not recall specifically?" Mallory's hands tightened upon the table edge. "Mr. Holmes, I have confessed my guilt. I do not understand the purpose of these questions. What difference does it make which particular bottle of ink I employed? Humour me, if you would. When did you purchase this ink?" "I cannot say precisely. Several months ago, perhaps." Holmes rose and began to pace the narrow confines of the room. "Mr. Mallory, I have examined the ink in question. It is a standard formulation, widely available, and the sample from your desk matches the sample extracted from the altered documents with remarkable precision. Yet I must tell you that such precision troubles me." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "Mr. Holmes, surely a match is a match. What could be troubling about evidence that confirms the confession? What troubles me, Inspector, is the nature of ink itself. It is a variable substance, affected by exposure to air, by temperature, by the conditions of storage. 2 bottles purchased from the same stationer on the same day may age differently depending on how they are kept, how frequently they are opened, how much air they contain. Yet the ink from Mallory's desk and the ink in the forgeries are not merely similar. They are, according to your chemist, identical in every measurable particular." "Suggesting what?" I asked. "Suggesting either remarkable coincidence or deliberate selection." Holmes turned to Mallory. "When did you last use the ink from your desk before the alleged forgeries?" "I use it daily, sir. It is my working supply." "And yet the bottle was found to be nearly full when examined by the police. Does that not strike you as odd?" Mallory's face betrayed genuine confusion. "I do not keep a record of how much ink I use, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps I had recently opened a new bottle." Holmes resumed his seat and withdrew his pocket lens, which he directed toward Mallory's hands. "Your right hand, if you please." The clerk extended his hand with obvious bewilderment, and Holmes examined it closely, particularly the fingers and the area between thumb and forefinger. "You're right-handed, Mr. Mallory?" "I am." "And you work daily with pen and ink?" "Of course." "Yet I observe no staining upon your fingers, no residual discoloration of the sort that invariably marks those who handle ink regularly. "Sir, your hands are quite clean." Mallory withdrew his hand and examined it himself. "I wash thoroughly, Mr. Holmes. I've always been particular about personal cleanliness." "Admirable," said Holmes dryly. He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, the draft discovered in Mallory's lodgings. You brought it with you?" Lestrade produced the document from his case, and Holmes spread it upon the table. The practised forgeries stared up at us, testament to someone's careful preparation. Holmes studied them through his lens with meticulous attention, paying particular heed to the paper itself. "Mr. Mallory, where did you obtain this paper?" "I suppose from the stationery cupboard at the court. We have free access to supplies for legitimate work." "You suppose, but you do not recall definitely." "Mr. Holmes, I am trying to answer your questions honestly, but you seem determined to find fault with everything I say. I committed these forgeries. I've admitted as much. Why can you not accept the simple truth?" Holmes set down his lens and regarded the young man with an expression I found difficult to interpret. "Because, Mr. Mallory, the simple truth is rarely as simple as it appears. Let me share with you an observation. This draft, which purports to be your practice work, is written upon paper that differs subtly from the paper used in your daily correspondence. The watermark is distinct, the weight slightly heavier. This is not court stationery at all, but a higher quality stock sold by private vendors." "Perhaps I purchased it for this specific purpose," Mallory said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps. Yet you cannot recall doing so, just as you cannot recall the specific details of the forgeries themselves, nor the purchase of the ink, nor how a nearly full bottle came to contain the precise formulation used in the crime. Your confession is comprehensive in its admission of guilt, but remarkably vague in its particulars." A silence fell over the room. Mallory stared at his hands, and I observed a tremor in his shoulders that might have been suppressed emotion. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What would you have me say, Mr. Holmes?" "That I am innocent." "I cannot claim innocence. The evidence is against me, and I have acknowledged my wrongdoing. If the details escape me, it is perhaps because I wish to forget what I have done." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed upon Mallory's face. "I would have you say what is true, not what you believe you must say. Tell me this, and consider carefully before you answer. Are you certain, beyond any doubt, that you committed these forgeries?" Mallory raised his eyes, and in them I saw a confusion so profound that it struck me with almost physical force. "I must have done, Mr. Holmes. Who else could it have been? The key was mine, the hand was mine, the ink was mine. Every circumstance points to my guilt. How can I claim otherwise when the evidence speaks so plainly?" "Evidence," said Holmes quietly, "can be arranged to speak as its arranger wishes, but let us return to the physical materials themselves." He withdrew from his pocket a small magnifying glass of unusual power and directed it toward the photographic reproductions. "Inspector, you noted earlier that the alterations showed remarkable skill. I would go further and say they show something more than skill. They show knowledge." "Knowledge of what?" Lestrade demanded. "Knowledge of how ink behaves upon paper. Observe here, where a date has been changed." The original figures were scraped away with extreme delicacy, leaving the paper surface barely disturbed. The new figures were then applied with precisely the correct pressure to match the surrounding text. Too heavy a hand would have caused the ink to spread into the disturbed fibres. Too light would have resulted in an obviously different appearance, yet the forger achieved perfect balance. "Suggesting a practised hand," said Lestrade. "Suggesting more than that, suggesting someone who understands the chemistry and physics of ink, paper, and time. Someone who knows how freshly applied ink behaves differently from aged ink, and who has taken steps to disguise that difference." I felt a chill of comprehension beginning to form. "You mean the ink was treated in some way?" "I mean, Watson, that I observed microscopic inconsistencies in the drying patterns and in the way the ink has been absorbed by the paper fibres. These are not the characteristics of writing done in the normal course of events. They are the characteristics of writing that has been artificially aged. Mallory looked up sharply. Artificially aged? I do not understand. Nor should you, unless you possess knowledge of chemical processes beyond the scope of ordinary clerking. Yet someone possessed such knowledge, someone who wished these alterations to appear older than they truly are. Or perhaps, Holmes paused meaningfully, younger than they truly are. Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade with barely controlled exasperation, you are speaking in riddles. What precisely are you suggesting? Holmes rose and gathered the photographs. I am suggesting, Inspector, that we require a more thorough examination of the original documents themselves. The reproductions can tell us only so much. I wish to perform chemical tests upon the ink, to examine the paper under conditions of controlled light, and to determine, if possible, when these alterations were actually made. To what end? To establish whether the fundamental assumption underlying this entire case, the assumption that the forgeries are recent, is in fact correct. We departed the interview room shortly thereafter, leaving Mallory in a state of visible confusion. As we emerged into the corridor, Lestrade turned to Holmes with an expression of mingled frustration and uncertainty. You have raised doubts, Mr. Holmes, but you have proven nothing. The man has confessed. He has confessed to a crime he cannot clearly remember, and for which he offers no coherent motive beyond vague financial desperation. That, Lestrade, is what I find most troubling of all. Holmes said nothing more until we had regained the street, where the noise and bustle of London provided a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the courthouse. Then he turned to me with that familiar gleam of intellectual excitement. The game is deeper than it appears, Watson. We must examine those documents at the earliest opportunity. I have a theory forming, but I require evidence to support it. Evidence I fear. That may prove as disturbing as it is decisive. Chapter 5. The Language of Guilt. Holmes insisted upon returning to Baker Street before pursuing further inquiries, and I accompanied him in thoughtful silence. The interview with Mallory had left me with an uneasy sense that we had witnessed something more complex than a criminal's remorse. There was an element of bewilderment in the young clerk's manner that seemed incompatible with deliberate wrongdoing. Upon reaching our lodgings, Holmes immediately set about examining his chemical apparatus, which occupied a corner of our sitting room in what I can only describe as organised chaos. He extracted several bottles of ink, various paper samples, and an array of testing solutions, arranging them upon the table with the precision of a surgeon laying out his instruments. Sir Watson, said he without looking up from his preparations, you're a medical man. When a patient presents with symptoms that conform precisely to a textbook description of a disease, does that invariably confirm the diagnosis? I considered the question carefully. Not invariably, no. Some conditions mimic others, and some patients unconsciously adopt symptoms they believe they should exhibit. Precisely so. And if a patient had been told by multiple authorities that he suffered from a particular ailment, might he not come to believe it himself, even absent any genuine affliction? The power of suggestion can be considerable, especially in suggestible temperaments. Holmes nodded, mixing 2 solutions in a beaker and observing the resulting reaction. Then consider young Mallory. He's confronted with evidence that appears incontrovertible: his handwriting, his ink, his key, his opportunity. Witnesses place him near the scene. A damning draught is found in his lodgings. What conclusion would a reasonable man draw? That he was guilty? And if that reasonable man were already anxious, already uncertain of himself, already burdened by financial difficulties and the strain of his position, might he not accept this conclusion despite his own confused recollection of events? You believe his confession is false? Holmes set down his beaker and turned to face me. I believe his confession is incomplete. There is a difference, Watson. He has confessed to actions he believes he must have committed based upon evidence he cannot dispute. But belief is not memory. And evidence can be fabricated by those sufficiently clever and sufficiently motivated. But the handwriting, Holmes, the expert confirmed it was Mallory's. The expert confirmed that the alterations were made by the same hand that produced Mallory's correspondence. That is not quite the same thing as confirming Mallory made them. I must have shown my confusion, for Holmes smiled faintly and continued. Handwriting can be copied, Watson. With sufficient practice and skill, what appears to be Mallory's hand may be an excellent forgery of Mallory's hand. The irony would be rather elegant, would it not? A forger framed by forgery. Before I could respond to this startling proposition, Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. To my surprise, it was not Lestrade, but a younger man whose card identified him as Harold Pemberton, solicitor. Holmes received him with evident interest. "Mr. Pemberton," said Holmes, "I do not believe we have met, yet your name is familiar to me. You are perhaps related to the Miss Pemberton who serves as typist at the Court of Chancery." "My sister, Mr. Holmes. It is on her account that I have come. She is considerably distressed by her involvement in this matter, and has asked me to convey to you certain observations she felt unable to share with the police." "Pray be seated and tell me everything." Pemberton settled himself nervously. "You must understand that my sister is a woman of scrupulous honesty and some timidity. When Inspector Lestrade interviewed her, she felt pressured to confirm what he seemed to expect rather than to describe precisely what she observed." "A common failing in witness testimony," Holmes remarked. "Lestrade is an excellent officer, but he sometimes guides his witnesses more than he realizes. What did your sister actually observe on the evening of October 7th? "She heard footsteps in the corridor, as she reported. She heard the sound of papers being handled. But when Lestrade suggested these sounds came from the archive room, she did not contradict him, though in truth she could not be certain of their precise origin. The corridor serves several offices, and sound carries strangely in those old buildings." "Did she observe the light beneath the archive door?" "She saw a light, yes, but whether it emanated from the archive or from an adjacent chamber she cannot swear. Mr. Holmes, my sister fears she may have contributed to a miscarriage of justice through her failure to be more precise in her testimony." Holmes waved his hand dismissively. "Your sister has done more good by this second account than harm by the first. Tell her she need not trouble her conscience further. Is there anything else?" "Only this. She mentioned to the inspector that she heard footsteps, but she did not mention that she heard them twice, once approaching and once departing. The approaching footsteps were slow and deliberate. The departing ones were quick, almost hurried. At the time, she attributed this to someone completing their work and hastening home, but upon reflection, she wonders if it might signify something more. 2 different persons, perhaps, Holmes suggested. That had occurred to her. Yes. After Pemberton had departed with Holmes's assurances that his sister's information would be treated with appropriate seriousness, I turned to my friend with renewed interest. This casts rather a different light on the witness testimony. It suggests what I have suspected from the beginning, Watson. The evidence against Mallory is circumstantial and interpretative. What appears to be proof is merely consistency with a predetermined narrative. Strip away the assumptions, and we're left with precious little of substance. He returned to his chemical experiments, and for the next hour I watched as he tested various ink samples, comparing their behaviour under different conditions. He applied small quantities to paper, observed their absorption, subjected them to heat and cold, and made copious notes in his pocketbook. Finally, he sat back with an expression of grim satisfaction. As I suspected, Watson. Fresh ink behaves quite differently from aged ink when subjected to certain chemical treatments. The iron in the gall formulation oxidizes over time, creating compounds that react distinctively to acidic solutions. These altered documents, according to Lestrade's chemist, contain ink that matches Mallory's supply, but the chemist tested only for composition, not for age. And you believe the ink is older than it appears? I believe it may be significantly older than the 3-month window Lestrade has assumed, but I require access to the original documents to confirm this hypothesis. We dined that evening at Simpson's, and throughout the meal Holmes remained abstracted, his mind clearly occupied with the ramifications of the case. It was only as we were taking our coffee that he spoke again of the matter. There is one element that particularly intrigues me, Watson. Mallory's language when speaking of his alleged crime. His language. You will recall that he consistently referred to his actions as corrections rather than forgeries or alterations. When I pressed him on the details, he spoke of making things right and fixing errors. This is not the language of a criminal attempting to defraud, but of someone who believed he was performing a legitimate function. Perhaps he was rationalizing his guilt. Perhaps. Or perhaps he was describing what he had been told he was doing. Consider, Watson, if someone wished to use Mallory as an unwitting accomplice, they might frame the task as correction of clerical errors rather than criminal falsification. A junior clerk told by a superior that certain documents contained mistakes requiring amendment would perform the work without questioning its propriety. But surely he would remember such instructions. Would he? If the instructions were given weeks or months ago, couched in routine administrative language, would they stand out in his memory, or would they blur into the general mass of his daily duties? Holmes paused, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. And if, later, that same clerk were confronted with evidence of forgery and told that he alone could have committed it, might he not search his memory for any action that could account for the evidence and fasten upon those legitimate corrections as proof of his guilt? The theory was ingenious, yet I could not help but voice the obvious objection. The draft found in his lodgings, Holmes. That suggests premeditation and secrecy, not innocent correction of errors. The draft troubles me greatly, Watson, precisely because it is so perfectly incriminating. It is the one piece of evidence that cannot be explained away by confusion or suggestion. And yet, consider its discovery. Lestrade obtained a warrant to search Mallory's rooms after the confession, seeking evidence of his mysterious employer. Instead, he found evidence of the crime itself, hidden beneath a floorboard in a manner that suggests both cunning and carelessness. I fail to see the contradiction. A cunning criminal conceals evidence. A careless criminal leaves it in plain sight. To carefully hide evidence beneath a floorboard, only to confess before that evidence could be discovered, may suggest a mind at war with itself. Or, Holmes set down his cup with a decisive gesture, it suggests evidence planted by someone who wished it to be found, who needed it to be found, to seal the case against Mallory beyond all possible doubt. You believe someone entered his lodgings and planted the draft. I believe it is a possibility that warrants investigation. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall visit Mallory's residence and speak with his landlady. We shall also call upon Mr. Halberd and request access to the original documents. The time has come to test assumptions against evidence, rather than moulding evidence to fit assumptions. We walked back to Baker Street through the evening fog, and I found myself torn between scepticism and conviction. Holmes had raised numerous questions, had pointed out inconsistencies and improbabilities, yet the fundamental facts remained unchanged. Mallory's handwriting, Mallory's ink, Mallory's key, Mallory's confession. And yet, as Holmes had observed, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. I retired that night with a growing sense that we stood upon the threshold of a revelation that would overturn everything we thought we understood about this seemingly simple case. In this, at least, my instinct proved entirely correct. Chapter 6. Witnesses of Convenience. The morning brought rain, a persistent drizzle that turned the London streets into rivers of mud and rendered the atmosphere peculiarly oppressive. Holmes had sent word to Lestrade requesting interviews with the other clerks employed at the Court of Chancery, and by 10 o'clock we found ourselves once again in those labyrinthine corridors, this time directed to a large office where several junior clerks performed their daily duties. The room was a model of bureaucratic efficiency, with rows of desks arranged in precise order, each occupied by a figure bent over ledgers or documents. The scratch of pens and the rustle of paper provided a constant background murmur, punctuated occasionally by the opening and closing of file drawers. Mr. Halberd had arranged for us to use a small anteroom for our interviews, and it was there that we received the first of Mallory's colleagues. Samuel Griggs, the night porter who had observed Mallory entering the building on October 3rd, proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years, with the deliberate manner of one who has spent a lifetime in minor officialdom, and he settled himself with evident self-importance and regarded us with the air of a man who knew his testimony carried weight. "Mr. Griggs," Holmes began, "you reported seeing Edwin Mallory enter the building at 8:30 on the evening of October 3rd. Is that correct?" "Quite correct, sir. I keep meticulous records. Every person who enters after hours must sign the register, and I note the time myself." "And Mallory stated his purpose." "Said he'd forgotten some papers for the morning. Not unusual, sir. These young clerks are often forgetful." "You described him as nervous and agitated. Upon what did you base this observation?" Griggs frowned as though the question challenged his competence. "His manner, sir. He seemed ill at ease, wouldn't meet my eye. Fumbled with the pen when signing the register. Did he remain long in the building?" "Perhaps an hour. Signed out at 9:30. Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "During that hour, did you observe anyone else entering or leaving?" "No one, sir. It was a quiet evening." "And you remained at your post throughout?" Here Griggs hesitated, and I observed a flicker of discomfort cross his features. "I may have stepped away briefly to attend to a matter in the basement, a leaking pipe, sir, but I was gone no more than 10 minutes. During which time anyone might have entered or departed without your knowledge." "Well, yes, I suppose so, but the register can be signed or left unsigned as one chooses," Holmes finished. "Thank you, Mr. Griggs. You have been most helpful." After the porter had departed, Holmes turned to me with a significant look. "Note, Watson, how certainty erodes under examination. Griggs was positive of Mallory's guilt based upon nervousness and an hour's unexplained presence, yet he cannot swear that others were not in the building, and nervousness may have a dozen innocent explanations." The next witness was Bartholomew Reed, the senior clerk who shared an office with Mallory. Reed was a man of perhaps 35, with thinning hair and the slightly hunched posture of one who spends his days bent over accounts. Unlike Griggs, he appeared uncomfortable with his role as witness. "Mr. Reed," said Holmes, "you reported that Mallory seemed distracted and anxious during the week of October 10th. What specifically did you observe?" Reed shifted in his chair. "It was more an impression than anything specific, mister." "Holmes, he seemed troubled, made errors in his work that were unlike him. Mallory is ordinarily quite precise." "Can you describe these errors?" "Misfiled documents, incorrect entries in the ledger. Small things, but unusual for him." "And you attributed this to guilt over the forgeries?" "I did not attribute it to anything at the time, sir. It was only later, when the inspector asked about Mallory's behaviour, that I recalled these incidents and saw them in a new light." Holmes leaned forward. "In a new light. That is a telling phrase, Mr. Reed. Did Inspector Lestrade suggest what that new light might reveal?" Reed flushed slightly. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual about Mallory's behaviour when I mentioned the errors and the distraction. He suggested these might indicate a troubled conscience. "And having heard this suggestion, you came to believe it?" "Well, it made sense, sir, in retrospect." "Retrospect is a powerful lens, Mr. Reed, but it can distort as easily as clarify. Tell me, during this week of distraction, did Mallory confide in you about any troubles? Debts, perhaps, or family difficulties?" "He mentioned that his mother had been unwell. He was worried about medical expenses." Holmes's eyebrows rose. "His mother was ill? This was not mentioned in Lestrade's report. When did he speak of this?" "Early in October, I believe. He asked if I knew of any positions that offered better compensation. He seemed anxious about money, but I attributed it to his family situation rather than anything criminal." Yet when Lestrade framed the question differently, "You attributed the same anxiety to guilt. Human nature is remarkably accommodating, is it not?" We interviewed 3 more clerks over the course of the morning, and in each case Holmes's patient questioning revealed the same pattern. Observations that were ambiguous in themselves had been interpreted through the lens of Mallory's presumed guilt. A nervous manner became evidence of conscience. Unusual behaviour became indication of criminal intent. Each witness had contributed a piece to the puzzle, but only because they had been shown where that piece was meant to fit. Our final interview was with a junior clerk named Thomas Wickham, a slight young man who'd been employed at the court for only 6 months. His testimony had not featured in Lestrade's report, and it was only Holmes's insistence on interviewing all of Mallory's colleagues that brought him to our attention. "Mr. Wickham," said Holmes, "you work in the same department as Edwin Mallory?" "I do, sir, though we have different responsibilities. I handle correspondence while Mallory manages the archives." "You were not asked to testify regarding his behaviour?" "I was not. I suppose because I had nothing particular to report." "Nothing particular often proves most significant. Tell me, did you observe anything unusual about Mallory during September or October?" Wickham considered carefully. "Nothing that struck me as criminal, sir, but there was one thing I thought odd at the time, though I mention it only because you ask." "Please continue." "In late September I observed Mr. Halberd speaking with Mallory in quite earnest tones. They were in the archive room, and I happened to pass by. I heard Mr. Halberd say something about corrections that must be made, and discretion being essential. At the time I assumed it referred to some administrative matter, but given recent events, I wonder if it might signify something more." Holmes became very still. "You're certain of the phrase, corrections that must be made?" "Quite certain, sir. It struck me because of the serious tone Mr. Halberd employed. He's usually rather brisk and impersonal in his dealings with junior staff." "Did Mallory respond?" "Not that I heard. I didn't linger, as I had no wish to appear to be eavesdropping." "When precisely did this conversation occur?" "The last week of September, sir. I remember because it was just before the quarter-end accounting, which made our office particularly busy." Holmes made several notes with evident satisfaction. "Mr. Wickham, you have been extraordinarily helpful. One final question. Have you observed any particular relationship between Mr. Halberd and Lord Blackwood, or any association between the chief archivist and persons who might benefit from the altered documents?" Wickham looked startled. "I have no knowledge of such matters, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Halberd maintains proper professional distance from all parties to the cases we handle. It would be most improper otherwise." "Indeed it would. Thank you, Mr. Wickham. You may return to your duties." After the young clerk had departed, Holmes sat for some moments in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I could see the rapid calculation taking place behind his eyes, the assembly of disparate facts into a coherent pattern. "Watson," he said at length, "we are beginning to see the shape of the truth. Mallory was told to make corrections by Halberd himself. He performed them in good faith, believing them to be legitimate amendments to clerical errors. Later, when the forgeries were discovered, he searched his memory and realized that he had indeed altered those very documents. The evidence confirmed what he had done, even if his intention had been innocent. But the draft hidden in his lodgings was planted there by someone who had access to his rooms and who needed to ensure that no possibility of innocence remained. Someone who understood that a confession alone might be challenged. But a confession supported by physical evidence would be unassailable. "Halberd," I said, the name escaping my lips as comprehension dawned. "Mr. Septimus Halberd, chief archivist, the very man who discovered the forgeries during his quarterly audit, the man who holds the master key, the man who had both opportunity and motive to manipulate these records months ago, and who needed a scapegoat when discovery became inevitable." Holmes rose and reached for his coat. "We must move carefully now, Watson. Halberd is no common criminal. He has demonstrated considerable intelligence in arranging this frame. We require incontrovertible proof before we can move against him. Tomorrow we shall examine those documents with our chemical tests. Tonight, however, we shall pay a visit to Mallory's landlady and learn who, if anyone, has recently shown unusual interest in her lodger's rooms. As we emerged from the Court of Chancery into the rain-soaked afternoon, I found myself reassessing everything I had believed about this case. What had seemed a straightforward matter of guilt and confession now appeared as an elaborate construction, built upon suggestion, misdirection, and the exploitation of an innocent man's uncertainty. The true criminal, it seemed, had hidden not in the shadows but in plain sight, secure in the knowledge that no one would suspect the very person responsible for exposing the crime. It was, I reflected, a strategy of remarkable audacity, and one that Sherlock Holmes was now determined to dismantle, piece by careful piece. Chapter 7. The Reinforced Theory. Mallory's lodgings occupied the upper floor of a narrow house in Clerkenwell, one of those respectable but modest establishments that cater to young men of limited means but decent prospects. The landlady, Mrs. Hendricks, proved to be a woman of middle years, with the sharp eyes and forthright manner of one accustomed to judging character quickly and accurately. She received us in her parlour, a neat room redolent of beeswax and lavender, and listened with evident distress as Holmes explained the nature of our inquiry. Her affection for her lodger was plain, and she bristled at any suggestion of his criminality. "Mr. Mallory is as fine a young gentleman as ever paid his rent on time," she declared. "Whatever the police may say, I'll not believe he's done anything dishonest. He's been with me these 14 months, and I've never had cause for complaint." "We do not come to judge him, Mrs. Hendricks," Holmes assured her, "but rather to establish certain facts that may bear upon his case. Tell me, has anyone shown particular interest in Mr. Mallory's rooms in recent weeks?" Mrs. Hendricks frowned. "Now that you mention it, sir, there was a gentleman called 3 weeks ago. Said he was from the court conducting some sort of review of employee accommodations. Wanted to see Mr. Mallory's room to ensure it met proper standards." Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. "Did this gentleman give a name?" "He did, though I confess it slipped my memory. I took him for official business, you understand, and he had such an authoritative manner. He showed me credentials of some sort, though I didn't examine them closely." "Can you describe him?" "A gentleman of mature years, well-dressed, with grey hair and spectacles. He spoke in that particular way educated men have, very precise and proper." "How long did he remain in Mr. Mallory's room?" "Perhaps a quarter of an hour. He asked me not to accompany him, said it was a matter of official procedure, and my presence might compromise the objectivity of his assessment. I thought it odd, but he seemed so certain of himself that I didn't question it." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. "And this was before Mr. Mallory's arrest?" "Oh, yes, sir. Must have been early October before all this dreadful business came to light." "Did Mr. Mallory know of this visit?" "I mentioned it to him that evening. He seemed puzzled, said he knew of no such review. But then the next day he told me he'd made inquiries and it was all quite proper, some new administrative policy. He didn't seem concerned." After obtaining a few more particulars, Holmes requested permission to examine Mallory's room ourselves. Mrs. Hendricks consented readily, and we ascended to the upper floor. The room proved to be small but well kept, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, a wardrobe, and little else. Holmes immediately set about examining the floorboards, paying particular attention to the area where the incriminating draught had been discovered. "Here, Watson," he said, indicating a section near the window. "You see where the board has been recently disturbed? The nails have been withdrawn and replaced, but not quite as they were originally. The wood shows fresh scratches." I knelt to examine the spot. Indeed, the signs of tampering were evident once pointed out, though I doubted I would have noticed them independently. Holmes produced his lens and studied the area minutely. The draught was concealed here, beneath this board, yet observe the dust patterns in the surrounding cracks. They suggest this board had not been disturbed for many months before being recently lifted. If Mallory had hidden the draught here himself, we would expect to see evidence of repeated access, of the board being lifted and replaced multiple times. Instead, we see a single recent disturbance. The visitor planted it. Almost certainly, he gained access to the room, lifted the board, placed the draught, and replaced it in such a way that Lestrade's search would uncover it. A masterstroke, really. The perfect final piece of evidence to seal Mallory's fate. We departed Clerkenwell with this intelligence and made our way directly to Scotland Yard, where we found Lestrade in his office, surrounded by the usual clutter of active investigations. He greeted us with weary courtesy, clearly expecting another theoretical objection to his case. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I trust you've come to tell me you found some obscure detail that overturns everything." "Not quite, Lestrade," Holmes replied, settling into a chair. "But I have found evidence that the draft discovered in Mallory's lodgings was planted there by person unknown, approximately 3 weeks before your search uncovered it." The inspector's expression darkened. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Holmes. Upon what do you base it?" Holmes recounted our interview with Mrs. Hendricks and his examination of the floorboards. Lestrade listened with increasing scepticism, his fingers drumming upon his desk. "Even if I accept your premise," he said when Holmes had finished, "it proves nothing. Perhaps Mallory arranged for an accomplice to hide the draft for him. Perhaps he feared his rooms might be searched. Then why confess before the draft was discovered? Why not maintain his innocence until confronted with this evidence? The chronology makes no sense, Lestrade." Before the inspector could respond, a constable entered bearing a message. Lestrade read it quickly, and his expression shifted from scepticism to something approaching triumph. "Mr. Holmes, it seems events have overtaken your theories. This telegram is from the court. During a final inventory of Mallory's desk, they have discovered another cache of documents, notes detailing the specific alterations to be made, including calculations of financial benefit to Lord Blackwood. The handwriting has been confirmed as Mallory's. This discovery was made not an hour ago." Holmes was very still. "Who conducted this inventory?" "Mr. Halberd, in the presence of 2 court officials. Everything was done properly, I assure you." "I'm certain it was. May we examine these documents?" "They're being brought here directly. You may see them when they arrive, though I doubt they'll support your increasingly elaborate conspiracy theory." We waited in Lestrade's office, and I observed that Holmes had lapsed into one of his intense meditative states, his eyes half closed and his breathing slow and regular. When the documents finally arrived, delivered by a court messenger, Holmes examined them with an attention that bordered on the obsessive. The notes were indeed damning. Written in what appeared to be Mallory's neat hand, they outlined the precise changes to be made to the Darnley inheritance records, along with calculations showing how these changes would benefit Lord Blackwood's claim. There were even references to the payment Mallory was to receive for his services. "Well, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade asked with barely concealed satisfaction. "What say you now?" Holmes set down the document slowly. "I say that the evidence against Edwin Mallory has become remarkably complete. So complete, in fact, that it strains credulity. You cannot accept when a case is simply solved, can you? You must always seek complications where none exist. On the contrary, Lestrade, I accept readily when evidence is genuine, but when evidence appears with such convenient timing, when each discovery reinforces the narrative with mathematical precision, I become suspicious. These notes, found only now after months of Mallory's employment, after his confession, after our investigation has begun to raise questions, does this not strike you as remarkably opportune?" "It strikes me as thorough police work. Mr. Halberd is conducting a comprehensive review precisely because you raise doubts. That he has found additional evidence confirming the original conclusion is hardly suspicious." Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the London evening. "Tell me, Lestrade, has it occurred to you to investigate Mr. Halberd himself, to inquire into his finances, his associates, his movements during the period when these forgeries were committed?" "Halberd is the chief archivist. He discovered the forgeries. Why on earth would I investigate him? Because he is the only person besides Mallory with unrestricted access to the archives. Because he holds the master key. Because he conducted the audit that revealed the alterations. Because he has been present at every significant discovery of evidence. And because," Holmes turned from the window, his eyes blazing with conviction, "he is the only person who benefits from Mallory's conviction." "Benefits? How does Halberd benefit?" "By ensuring that no one looks beyond the convenient scapegoat he has provided. Lestrade, I ask you formally to obtain authorization for me to examine the original altered documents with chemical testing equipment. I believe I can prove that those alterations were made months before Mallory ever had access to the archives." Lestrade sighed heavily. "Mr. Holmes, I have indulged your theories out of respect for your past successes, but this has gone too far. I have a confession, I have witnesses, I have physical evidence found in multiple locations, and now I have detailed notes outlining the criminal conspiracy. At what point does evidence become sufficient for you?" "At the point when it coheres naturally rather than accumulating artificially. These discoveries are too perfect, too timely, too convenient. Someone is constructing a case, Lestrade, piece by piece, and you're accepting each piece without questioning its provenance." The inspector's face flushed with anger. "I am conducting a professional investigation according to established procedures. If you have actual evidence of Halbert's involvement, present it. Otherwise, I must ask you to allow me to complete my work without further interference." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Lestrade. I shall obtain the necessary authorizations through other channels. But I warn you, when the truth emerges, you will find that you have been as much manipulated as young Mallory." We departed Scotland Yard in tense silence. Only when we had regained the street did Holmes speak, and his voice carried a note of grim determination I had rarely heard. "The game grows dangerous, Watson. Halbert knows we're closing in, and he is moving to seal every possible avenue of doubt. These new documents are his insurance, his final reinforcement of the narrative, but he has made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He has given us too much, too quickly. Evidence accumulates naturally over time, through patient investigation and gradual discovery. But this flood of incriminating material, each piece appearing precisely when needed to counter our doubts, it betrays the hand of an arranger. Tomorrow we shall conduct our chemical tests with or without Lestrade's blessing, and we shall prove that the foundation of this entire case is built upon sand." As we walked back through the fog-shrouded streets, I could not shake a feeling of profound unease. Somewhere in this city, a clever and ruthless criminal sat secure in the belief that his machinations had succeeded, and somewhere else, a confused and frightened young man awaited trial for crimes he could not clearly remember committing. The truth, I knew, lay suspended between these 2 points, waiting for Holmes's singular genius to illuminate it. But time, I feared, was not on our side. Chapter 8. Confidence and Closure. The following days brought a momentum to the case that seemed to sweep aside all objections. The Times carried a lengthy article detailing the forgery scandal, praising the swift justice that had brought the criminal to account. Lord Blackwood's claim was formally upheld by the Court of Chancery, and his restoration to fortune was celebrated in certain circles as a vindication of proper procedure and aristocratic privilege. Edwin Mallory was remanded for trial, his fate seemingly sealed by the accumulated weight of evidence. Even those who had initially expressed sympathy for the young clerk now spoke of him with certainty as a willing participant in fraud. The public appetite for scandal had been satisfied, and attention had already begun to shift to other matters. Holmes observed these developments with deepening frustration, though he maintained an outward composure that belied his inner turmoil. His request for chemical analysis of the original documents had been denied by the court on grounds that such testing might damage evidence required for trial. His appeals to higher authorities met with polite dismissal, the general sentiment being that the case had been adequately investigated and required no further scrutiny. "They are rushing to closure, Watson," he remarked one evening as we sat before the fire at Baker Street. "Nothing terrifies institutional authority quite so much as uncertainty. They have their culprit, their confession, their evidence. To suggest that all of this might be elaborate fiction threatens the very foundations upon which their confidence rests. Yet surely, Holmes, if you could but present your theory in full. A theory without proof is merely speculation, and speculation is easily dismissed. I require access to those documents, and that access is being systematically denied me. He drew upon his pipe with evident agitation. "Halberd has been quite brilliant, really. Each piece of evidence he has produced serves not only to confirm Mallory's guilt, but to make further investigation seem redundant. Why examine documents chemically when handwritten notes detail the precise nature of the forgeries? Why question the timeline when witnesses place the accused at the scene? The case has achieved a kind of perfect internal consistency that makes any challenge appear as willful obstinacy. I had rarely seen my friend so thwarted. His usual methods relied upon examination of physical evidence and the application of rigorous scientific analysis. Denied access to the primary materials, he found himself reduced to theoretical argument against a fortress of accepted fact. Yet he did not remain idle. Over the next week, Holmes pursued several lines of inquiry with characteristic tenacity. He investigated Halberd's background, discovering that the chief archivist had served in his position for nearly 20 years without blemish or scandal. He inquired into the man's finances, finding them neither conspicuously wealthy nor suspiciously modest. He attempted to trace any connection between Halberd and Lord Blackwood, but found no evidence of communication or association. "The man is either remarkably innocent or remarkably careful," Holmes admitted after one particularly frustrating day of investigation. "If he has been corrupted, the corruption is subtle and leaves no obvious trail. If he has benefited financially from the forgeries, that benefit has been well concealed." "Perhaps," I ventured, "Lestrade is correct, and Mallory is simply guilty as charged." Holmes fixed me with a penetrating stare. "You do not believe that, Watson. Not truly. You have seen too much to accept such a convenient resolution." He was right, of course. Despite the accumulation of evidence, despite Mallory's own confession, I could not shake the impression of something fundamentally wrong in the entire affair. The young clerk's confusion, the too perfect alignment of facts, the convenient timing of each new discovery, all of it suggested a constructed narrative rather than an organic investigation. On the 8th day after our visit to Scotland Yard, Holmes received a letter that altered the complexion of our inquiry. It came from a firm of solicitors representing Lord Blackwood's interests, and it requested in formal terms that Holmes cease his investigation into matters pertaining to the Darnley inheritance. The letter suggested that his activities constituted harassment and interference with legal proceedings, and hinted at potential civil action should he persist. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, reading the letter for a second time. "I have made no public statements, filed no official complaints, taken no action that would come to Lord Blackwood's attention through ordinary channels. Yet somehow he knows of my involvement, and feels sufficiently threatened to attempt intimidation through legal means. Could Lestrade have informed him? Lestrade would see no reason to do so. No, Watson, this intelligence came from someone closer to the investigation, someone who has been monitoring our activities and reporting them to interested parties. Halberd. It seems increasingly likely. Lord Blackwood benefits from the forgeries, Halberd executes them and frames Mallory for their discovery, and now Blackwood moves to suppress any inquiry that might disturb the arrangement. The pattern suggests collusion, though proving it remains frustratingly elusive. That same evening we received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hudson announced Mr. Wickham, the young clerk who had overheard Halberd instructing Mallory about corrections. Holmes received him immediately, and I observed that the young man appeared deeply troubled. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I have been dismissed from my position at the court. Mr. Halberd informed me this morning that my services are no longer required. He cited vague concerns about my reliability and attention to duty, but offered no specific complaints. This followed your testimony to us regarding the conversation you overheard." "It did, sir. I cannot prove a connection, but the timing strikes me as more than coincidental. I came to warn you that Mr. Halberd asked me pointedly whether I had spoken to anyone about court business. I admitted that you had interviewed me along with the other clerks. His manner changed immediately, became quite cold." Holmes nodded gravely. "He is closing ranks, eliminating any potential witnesses who might support an alternative narrative. Tell me, Mr. Wickham, Have you been offered any inducement to retract your statement about the conversation you overheard? Not directly, sir, but Mr. Halberd did mention that if I were to reconsider what I thought I heard, if I concluded I had been mistaken, he might be willing to reconsider his decision regarding my employment. And will you accept his offer? Wickham drew himself up with quiet dignity. I will not, Mr. Holmes. I know what I heard, and I will not perjure myself for the sake of the position, however much I may need the income. But I thought you should know that Halberd is actively attempting to suppress any information that might cast doubt upon the official narrative. After Wickham had departed with our assurances of assistance in finding new employment, Holmes paced the room with the restless energy that characterized his most intense cogitations. The net is tightening, Watson. Halberd knows we suspect him, knows we seek evidence to overturn Mallory's conviction. He is systematically eliminating witnesses, threatening legal action, and fortifying his position. Meanwhile, the machinery of justice grinds inexorably forward. Mallory's trial is scheduled for 3 weeks hence, and once a verdict is reached, any subsequent revelation of truth becomes infinitely more difficult to achieve. What can we do? Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face me, his expression one of fierce determination. We can conduct our own analysis, using materials that do not require court authorization. I have made certain arrangements, Watson. Tomorrow we shall have in our possession samples of the ink and paper used in the forgeries, along with comparative samples from various periods. I cannot examine the original documents, but I can test the hypothesis that such documents could be artificially aged to appear younger than they are. How did you obtain these samples? Through channels best left unspecified. Let us say that I have friends among the less prominent employees of the court, persons who retain more loyalty to truth than to institutional convenience. With these materials I can demonstrate the theoretical possibility of Halberd's scheme, even if I cannot prove it conclusively. The next morning a small package arrived bearing no return address. Holmes opened it with evident satisfaction, revealing several sheets of paper, 3 bottles of ink, and a set of notes detailing the provenance of each sample. He immediately set to work, and for the next 12 hours our sitting room became a laboratory of chemical analysis. I watched as Holmes tested the papers with various reagents, subjected them to heat and light, examined them under magnification, and recorded his observations with meticulous precision. The inks received similar treatment, their behaviour under different conditions noted and compared. As evening approached, Holmes sat back from his work with an expression of grim satisfaction. It can be done, Watson. With the right knowledge and materials, yet one can make alterations to documents that appear to be weeks old but are in fact months old. The process involves careful application of oxidizing agents to the ink, controlled exposure to light and heat, and subtle manipulation of the paper fibres themselves. It is not easy, but it is entirely possible for someone with expertise in archival conservation. Expertise that Halberd would possess. Precisely. As chief archivist, he would understand intimately how documents age, how ink degrades, how paper responds to environmental conditions. He could commit his forgeries months in advance, treat them to simulate recent application, and then discover them at the opportune moment. But can you prove this is what happened? Holmes's expression darkened. Not without examining the actual documents, which I am forbidden to do. I can demonstrate possibility, but not actuality. And possibility, I fear, will not suffice to overturn a conviction supported by confession and multiple corroborating pieces of evidence. We sat in silence as the implication settled upon us. Holmes had unravelled the method, had identified the perpetrator, had assembled a theory that explained every anomaly and inconsistency in the case. Yet without the definitive proof that only chemical analysis of the original documents could provide, his insights remained merely theoretical, easily dismissed by those invested in the accepted narrative. "There must be something we can do," I said at length. Holmes looked up, and in his eyes I saw a determination that had not wavered despite the obstacles arrayed against us. "There is one avenue remaining, Watson. If Halberd committed these forgeries months ago, before Mallory was even employed at the court, Then he must have had some reason for acting at that particular time. Events do not occur in isolation. There will be some trigger, some circumstance that prompted his action. If I can identify that circumstance, I may be able to establish a timeline that proves Mallory's innocence through sheer temporal impossibility. Where will you begin? With Lord Blackwood himself. Tomorrow we shall pay a visit to his lordship and inquire into the history of the Darnley inheritance. Somewhere in that history lies the key to understanding why Halberd acted when he did, and why he chose Mallory as his scapegoat. Holmes returned to his chemical apparatus, his movements infused with renewed purpose, and I retired that evening with a cautious hope that we might yet see justice served, though the obstacles remained formidable and time was running short. Chapter 9. The Flaw in Time. The morning was bright and cold when Holmes and I set forth for Lord Blackwood's residence in Belgravia. My friend had spent the previous evening in deep study of the Darnley inheritance case, poring over newspaper reports, legal summaries, and genealogical records with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something very specific. The key to any fraud, he had remarked as we prepared to depart, lies not in the execution but in the timing. Halberd did not wake one morning and decide arbitrarily to forge documents. He acted in response to some circumstance, some necessity. Identify that necessity, and we identify the moment when the forgeries must have been committed. Lord Blackwood received us with ill-concealed reluctance in a drawing-room, furnished with the heavy opulence characteristic of newly restored fortune. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with florid features and the bearing of one accustomed to deference. His manner toward Holmes was cold, though he maintained a veneer of courtesy. "Mr. Holmes, I confess I am surprised to see you here, after my solicitors made clear my wishes regarding your interference in this matter. I trust this visit concerns some other business." "On the contrary, Lord Blackwood, it concerns the Darnley inheritance most directly. I have several questions regarding the timeline of your claim, and I believe you are uniquely positioned to answer them." Blackwood's expression hardened. "The matter has been settled by the courts. My claim has been validated. I see no purpose in revisiting settled affairs." "Indulge me nonetheless. When did you first become aware that documents existed which might support your claim to the Darnley estate?" "I fail to see the relevance." "Humour me, if you please. It is a simple question of chronology." Blackwood hesitated, then gestured impatiently. "Very well. I became aware of the possibility through my own researches into family history. This would have been in March of last year. I engaged solicitors to pursue the matter, and they filed the initial claim in April." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "And when were the crucial documents, the ones that ultimately secured your claim, first brought to the attention of the court?" "The documents in question were part of the official archive. They had always been there, merely overlooked or misinterpreted by previous examinations." "Indeed? But when precisely did their significance become apparent to your legal team?" "I believe it was in June of last year. My solicitor discovered references to certain codicils during his review of the archive materials." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "June? 4 months before Edwin Mallory commenced his employment at the court. This is most illuminating. Tell me, during this period, did your legal team have extensive access to the archives?" "Of course. Such access is necessary for proper representation." "And did Mr. Halberd, the chief archivist, provide particular assistance in locating relevant documents?" For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Blackwood's features. "Mr. Halberd was professional and accommodating, as one would expect. I fail to see. Did he bring any documents to your solicitor's attention? Documents that prove particularly valuable to your case?" "He may have. Such details are better addressed to my legal representatives." Holmes rose smoothly. "Indeed they are. You have been most helpful, Lord Blackwood. One final question. During the period between June and October of last year, were you in communication with Mr. Halberd outside of official court business?" Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "I resent the implication of your question, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Halberd performed his duties properly, and any suggestion of impropriety is slanderous. I must ask you to leave." We departed Belgravia with this intelligence, and Holmes immediately directed our cab toward the offices of Blackwood solicitors. There, after some negotiation and the invocation of several professional connections, we obtained access to the records of their archive research during the spring and summer of the previous year. The pattern that emerged was precisely what Holmes had anticipated. In early June, Mr. Halberd had personally brought several documents to the attention of Blackwood's solicitor, Mr. Carruthers, suggesting they might be relevant to the pending claim. These documents, upon examination, proved to contain the codicils and amendments that ultimately secured Blackwood's inheritance. "Note the date, Watson," Holmes said, his finger tracing the relevant entry in the solicitor's log. June 14th, more than a year before the alterations were supposedly discovered, more than 2 months before Mallory was even employed. But these documents were legitimate at that point, were they not? The forgeries were not yet committed. Were they not? Consider the sequence of events. Halberd identifies documents valuable to Blackwood's claim. Blackwood's case proceeds based upon these documents. Then, in the autumn, questions arise about the authenticity of certain aspects of those same documents. An audit is conducted, irregularities are discovered, and a convenient scapegoat is found to explain them. But what if the irregularities were present from the beginning? What if Halberd altered the documents before bringing them to Blackwood's attention, knowing they would form the basis of the claim? Then the forgeries date to June or earlier, precisely, and Mallory, who did not begin his employment until August, could not possibly have committed them. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon in furious activity. He sent telegrams to various contacts, requesting specific information about archival procedures and chemical dating techniques. He reviewed his own experimental results, cross-referencing them with the timeline we had established. As evening fell, he sat before the fire, his expression one of intense concentration. "I have it, Watson," he said at length. "I understand now the full scope of Halberd's scheme. It is elegant in its conception and ruthless in its execution. Will you share your conclusion?" "Shortly. First, I must gather all the relevant parties. Tomorrow we shall convene at the Court of Chancery. Lestrade must be present, as must Halberd himself. I believe the time has come to expose this entire affair to the light of truth." "But you still lack proof," Holmes smiled, and in that smile I saw the confidence of certain knowledge. "I shall obtain proof, Watson, through the simple expedient of demonstrating temporal impossibility. Halberd cannot have committed his forgeries when Lestrade believes they were committed, because those forgeries were already in existence months earlier. And once that impossibility is established, the entire edifice of evidence collapses." The following morning found us once again in the labyrinthine corridors of the Court of Chancery. Holmes had arranged for a meeting in the archive room itself, citing the need to examine the physical layout in connection with his inquiry. Lestrade arrived looking harried and sceptical, clearly expecting another exercise in theoretical speculation. Mr. Halberd appeared composed, though I detected a wariness in his manner. Also present were Mr. Carruthers, representing Lord Blackwood's interests, and 2 court officials who would serve as witnesses to whatever demonstration Holmes intended to perform. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, standing before the shelves that held the Darnley inheritance files, "I have asked you here to resolve a matter that has troubled me from the inception of this case. We have all accepted, without question, that the alterations to these documents were made between July and October of this year. This assumption rests upon the fact that Mr. Halberd's quarterly audit in July found no irregularities, while his October audit discovered them. Therefore, we concluded the forgeries must have been committed during that 3-month interval." "A logical conclusion," Lestrade observed. "Logical, but incorrect. Mr. Halberd, would you be so good as to produce your audit records for June of last year?" The chief archivist's face went pale. "June of last year? That is before the period in question. I fail to see the relevance." "Nevertheless, I should like to review those records. You do maintain comprehensive documentation of your audits, do you not?" "Of course, but—" "Then pray produce them." With evident reluctance, Halberd retrieved a ledger from a locked cabinet and handed it to Holmes. My friend examined it carefully, then turned to the assembled group. This ledger shows that Mr. Halberd conducted an audit of the Darnley files on June 12th of last year. He noted, and I quote, "All documents present and in good order, no irregularities observed." Yet 2 days later, on June 14th, he brought several of these same documents to the attention of Mr. Carruthers, suggesting they supported Lord Blackwood's claim. "Mr. Carruthers, can you confirm this?" The solicitor consulted his own records. "The date is correct, yes." Holmes continued, his voice taking on a prosecutorial edge. "Now, Mr. Halberd, if these documents were in good order on June 12th, and yet they supported Blackwood's claim on June 14th, we must conclude one of two things. Either you failed to notice irregularities during your audit, or the irregularities did not exist at that time. Which is it?" Halberd's composure was cracking. "I merely brought certain documents to the solicitor's attention. I made no representation regarding their ultimate significance." "But you did represent them as authentic during your audit. You certified them as being in good order, and yet when examined closely by Mr. Carruthers, they happened to contain precisely the codicils and amendments necessary to support Blackwood's claim. How remarkable that such valuable information escaped your notice during the audit, only to become apparent 2 days later." "What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade demanded. "I am suggesting that Mr. Halberd altered these documents prior to June 14th of last year, and then brought them to Mr. Carruthers' attention, knowing they would form the basis of Blackwood's claim. The subsequent discovery of irregularities in October was a fabrication, designed to provide an explanation for alterations that were already known to exist. And Edwin Mallory, who was not even employed here when the true forgeries were committed, was selected as a convenient scapegoat." The archive room fell silent. All eyes turned to Halberd, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "This is pure speculation. You have no proof." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, producing a document from his coat. "I have a sworn statement from a paper conservator who examined samples of the altered documents at my request. His analysis confirms that the alterations were made not in September or October of this year, but more than 12 months ago. The chemical composition of the ink, the degree of oxidation, the integration of the fibres, all point to forgeries committed in the spring or early summer of last year. How did you obtain samples?" Halberd's voice was rising now, control slipping away. "Through the same intermediaries you used to plant evidence in Mallory's lodgings and desk. It seems your anonymous visitor to Mrs. Hendricks was observed by a neighbour who provided a description matching you precisely. The game is over, Mr. Halberd. The timeline proves Mallory's innocence, and your own actions prove your guilt." For a moment I thought Halberd might attempt denial or evasion, but then something seemed to break within him. His shoulders sagged, and when he looked up his expression was one of exhausted defeat. "How much did Blackwood pay you?" Holmes asked quietly. £500 initially. Another 500 upon successful conclusion of the case. The words came mechanically, as though spoken by someone already condemned. I needed the money. My daughter's illness, the treatments, the specialists. I had no other recourse. "So you betrayed your position, corrupted public records, and destroyed an innocent man's life." "I never meant for Mallory to be harmed. I thought it would be seen as a simple clerical error, nothing more. But when the scrutiny began, when questions were raised, I had to ensure the blame fell elsewhere. I had to protect myself, protect my daughter." Lestrade moved forward, his hand on Halberd's shoulder. "Septimus Halberd, I am placing you under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice." As the former chief archivist was led away, Holmes turned to me with an expression of profound weariness. "Justice, Watson, but at what cost? A young man's reputation nearly destroyed, his life thrown into chaos, all because we assume the obvious rather than questioning the fundamental premises." "But you did question them, Holmes. You saw through the deception." "Eventually. The tragedy is that it nearly came too late. Chapter 10. The Perils of Certainty. The aftermath of Halbert's arrest unfolded with the swift efficiency characteristic of institutional embarrassment. Within 48 hours, Edwin Mallory was released from custody, his confession deemed invalid and all charges withdrawn. Lord Blackwood's claim to the Darnley estate was suspended pending a comprehensive review of the archival materials, and a formal inquiry was launched into the procedures that had allowed such extensive fraud to remain undetected. The newspapers, which had so recently proclaimed the case solved and justice served, now filled their columns with outraged editorials about official incompetence and the near miscarriage of justice. Lestrade, to his credit, acknowledged his error with professional grace, though I knew the matter weighed heavily upon him. It was on a grey afternoon, some 3 days after the resolution, that Holmes and I sat once more in our rooms at Baker Street. The case files spread before us in final review. Holmes had been unusually quiet since Halbert's confession, and I sensed in him that peculiar melancholy that sometimes followed the conclusion of his most significant investigations. "You are troubled, Holmes," I observed. He looked up from the document he had been studying and set it aside with a gesture of finality. "I am reflecting, Watson, on the nature of certainty and the ease with which intelligent men can be led into error. This case has been instructive, though not in the manner I would have chosen. You solved it brilliantly. Mallory is free, and the true culprit has been brought to account. Yet consider how nearly it ended otherwise. Had I accepted Lestrade's evidence at face value, had I not questioned the fundamental assumption about timing, Mallory would have been convicted and Halbert would have escaped entirely. The machinery of justice was operating perfectly, Watson, yet it was operating in service of a falsehood." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the London afternoon. Every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. The handwriting analysis, the ink composition, the exclusive access, the witness testimony, the confession itself, all of it coherent, all of it mutually reinforcing. Lestrade conducted his investigation with diligence and professionalism. He followed proper procedures, consulted experts, documented his findings, yet he arrived at a completely incorrect conclusion. Because the evidence was fabricated, because the evidence was arranged, Watson. That is the crucial distinction. Halbert did not create evidence from nothing. He used genuine materials, Mallory's actual handwriting, Mallory's actual ink, Mallory's actual key. He exploited real circumstances, Mallory's legitimate access to the archives, his financial difficulties, his nervous temperament. The genius of the scheme lay not in invention but in manipulation. Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his pipe, a gesture I had come to associate with his most philosophical moods. Consider the psychology of the thing. Mallory was told to make corrections to documents. He did so in good faith, believing he was performing routine clerical work. Months later, when confronted with evidence that those same documents had been criminally altered, what could he conclude? He had no memory of criminal intent, yet the physical facts seemed irrefutable. His handwriting, his ink, his opportunity. Faced with such evidence, a suggestible mind accepts the narrative it is given, even against its own recollection. The power of authority, I suggested, and the power of accumulated detail. Each new piece of evidence, the witness accounts, the hidden draft, the detailed notes, served not merely to prove Mallory's guilt, but to overwhelm his capacity for doubt. How could he maintain his innocence when everyone, including himself, believed him guilty? The human mind seeks coherence, Watson. When presented with facts that appear to form a consistent pattern, it actively resists information that would disturb that consistency. I considered this observation carefully. Yet you resisted. You questioned the pattern from the beginning. Because I have learned to distrust perfection. In nature, in human affairs, in criminal enterprises, nothing aligns quite so neatly as Lestrade's case against Mallory. Evidence accumulates messily, witnesses contradict themselves, facts remain ambiguous. When I encounter a case in which everything fits together with mathematical precision, I suspect not truth but construction. He drew upon his pipe, releasing a cloud of smoke that drifted toward the ceiling. The other element that troubled me was linguistic. Mallory consistently referred to his supposed crimes as corrections and spoke of making things right. This was not the language of deliberate fraud, but of someone who had been told he was fixing errors. That single verbal clue suggested an entirely different narrative than the one Lestrade had accepted. And the timing, I added. Your insistence on determining when the forgeries were actually committed. The unquestioned premise, Watson. Everyone assumed the alterations were recent because they were recently discovered. It is a natural assumption, perhaps even a reasonable one under ordinary circumstances, but it was merely an assumption, unverified and untested. Once I began to question it, the entire structure of the case began to shift. If the forgeries predated Mallory's employment, then all the subsequent evidence became suspect. The handwriting might be forged, the witnesses might be mistaken, the confession might be coerced or suggested. There came a knock at our door and Mrs. Hudson announced Edwin Mallory himself. Holmes received him warmly, and I observed that the young clerk, though still pale and shaken, had regained some measure of composure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice unsteady with emotion. "I have come to thank you for my freedom and my life. I do not know how to express adequately what you have done for me." Holmes waved away the gratitude with characteristic diffidence. "You owe me no thanks, Mr. Mallory. I merely followed the evidence where it led. Tell me, how do you fare? I am still attempting to comprehend what occurred. To think that I believed myself guilty, that I confessed to crimes I did not commit. It troubles me deeply, Mr. Holmes. How could I have been so mistaken about my own actions?" "You were not mistaken precisely. You were manipulated by someone who understood the vulnerability of memory and the power of suggestion. Halberd instructed you to make corrections to documents. You did so, believing it legitimate work. When later confronted with evidence that those documents had been criminally altered, you searched your memory for any action that might account for the evidence. The corrections you had made in good faith became in your mind evidence of criminal intent. But I should have known. I should have remembered clearly." Holmes leaned forward, his expression grave but kind. "Mr. Mallory, the human mind is not a perfect recording instrument. Memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. We do not recall events exactly as they occurred, but rather as we believe they must have occurred, based upon our current understanding. When multiple authorities, police, experts, witnesses, all confirmed your guilt, your mind accepted that narrative and shaped your memories to conform to it. This is not weakness, but rather a fundamental characteristic of human cognition." Mallory absorbed this explanation with visible relief, as though Holmes had absolved him of some deeper failure. "The court has offered to reinstate my position, though under a new chief archivist. I confess I am uncertain whether to accept. The memories of this place are difficult." "Then perhaps a fresh start would serve you better," Holmes suggested. "I have certain connections in the publishing trade. If you're interested in a position that would utilize your careful hand and attention to detail in a different context, I should be happy to provide an introduction." The young man's face brightened. "I would be most grateful, Mr. Holmes." After Mallory had departed with our assurances of assistance, Holmes returned to his contemplative mood. We sat in companionable silence for some time before he spoke again. "The case troubles me in one final aspect, Watson. Halberd's motive, while criminal, was comprehensible. His daughter's illness required funds he did not possess. He betrayed his position not from simple greed, but from desperation. In that desperation, he convinced himself that his crime was victimless, that he was merely helping Blackwood to an inheritance that might well be legitimate, and that no one would be harmed by the alteration of a few dusty records. Yet Mallory nearly paid with his freedom, perhaps his life. Indeed, and that is the final lesson of this affair. Halberd did not intend to destroy Mallory. The young clerk was to be at worst a minor scapegoat for what Halberd imagined would be seen as administrative oversight. But once the machinery of investigation and prosecution was engaged, it developed a momentum of its own. Each piece of fabricated evidence demanded another to support it. Each lie required additional lies to maintain consistency. What began as a limited fraud escalated into a comprehensive conspiracy, not through planning, but through the inexorable logic of concealment. He set down his pipe and regarded me with that penetrating gaze I'd come to know so well. That is the true peril of certainty, Watson. Once we believe we have solved a puzzle, once we have assembled facts into a coherent narrative, we become invested in that narrative. We interpret new information to support it, dismiss contradictions as anomalies, and resist any suggestion that our conclusions might be incorrect. This is true not merely for individuals, but for institutions, for police departments, courts, newspapers, and the public at large. Yet you resisted that certainty. I resisted it because I have made it a practice to doubt, particularly when doubt seems unreasonable. There is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact, Watson. I have built my career upon that principle, and this case has vindicated it once again. He rose and moved to his chemistry table, where the various samples and test results from his experiments still lay arranged in careful order. The satisfaction of this work lies not in being correct, though I confess that gives me pleasure, but in the pursuit of truth through rigorous method. Evidence must be questioned, assumptions must be tested, and conclusions must be held tentatively until proven beyond all possible doubt. It is laborious. It is sometimes frustrating, and it often leads to conflict with those who prefer swift resolution to careful analysis. Yet it is the only approach that serves justice rather than mere efficiency. I watched as he began to pack away his equipment, returning the chemicals to their proper places with meticulous care. In that moment, I understood more clearly than ever before the nature of my friend's singular genius. It lay not in some superhuman capacity for observation or deduction, though these were considerable, but in his unwavering commitment to question what others accepted, to doubt what others believed certain, and to follow the thread of truth even when it led into uncomfortable territory. "You will write this up, Watson?" he asked, glancing at me with a slight smile. "I shall, though I fear the public may find it less satisfying than your more sensational cases. There is no murder, no dramatic confrontation, no brilliant solution delivered in a moment of revelation. On the contrary, my dear fellow, this case contains the most important lesson I can offer to your readers. It demonstrates that the greatest threat to justice is not criminal cunning, but institutional certainty. The conviction that a case is solved when merely it appears solved, that evidence is conclusive when merely it is consistent, and that truth has been discovered when merely a plausible narrative has been constructed." He moved to the window once more, his silhouette dark against the fading afternoon light. "Let your account emphasize this above all else, that in matters of justice, as in matters of science, we must remain forever vigilant against our own tendency toward premature conclusion. Doubt, properly applied, is not the enemy of knowledge but its most essential guardian. I have endeavoured in setting down this account to honour my friend's wishes. The case of the corrupted court archive may lack the dramatic flourishes of murder or international intrigue, yet it reveals with particular clarity the methods and principles that define Sherlock Holmes's approach to his singular profession. In an age that increasingly values efficiency over accuracy, speed over thoroughness, and consensus over rigorous inquiry, his example stands as a necessary corrective. The peril of certainty remains ever present in all times and all circumstances. Against that peril, we have only the disciplined application of reason, the courage to question accepted narratives, and the persistence to pursue truth wherever it may lead. These are the lessons Sherlock Holmes taught me, and these are the lessons I trust this narrative has conveyed to those who read it.